Good afternoon. My name is Peggy Goldwyn, and I'm on the board of the Andrus Center for Public Policy. And I first heard Betty Ann's remarkable story because my stepson, Tony Goldwyn, was determined to bring her story to life on the screen. And 9 years later, it resulted in this remarkable film. Even before I saw the film, I was in awe of Betty Ann. But the wonderful moment I remember was going to the London premiere and meeting her in person through Tony's then 18-year-old daughter, Anna, and the three of us spent 2 days in London having girly time. So at that time, I was just so focused after 9 years on Betty Ann's story, but it was a year later in New York City that the impact of the work of the Innocence Project really came home for me when I went to their annual dinner. And they have the custom each year of calling out the class of that year, the men that they'd been able to release from prison. So this class walked up on stage, and only one person was missing, and a member of the board, and the board always has an exonerated prisoner as a member of the board, read a telegram from the one person who didn't come, and he said, "When I was in prison, my wife divorced me. After I was released, we got back together, and we're on our honeymoon." So Betty Ann's story made me cry, and that story made me cry. I think you're going to feel as I do, but I'm going to pull it together for a moment and just remind you that you have slips on the paper. On your table, these slips of paper you can fill in with questions because we will be taking questions, and I only ask that if you didn't win the penmanship award, please print. So it was with extreme pleasure I'd like to welcome Betty Ann Waters.
That trail always gets me. I always think it's about somebody else. I want to thank Peggy Goldwyn and Kathy Scott, the two people that I've talked to the most that invited me to be part of your forum and to come to Boise. I've never been here before, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of it. So far, I really like it, and the people are so nice. So thank you. Okay. I wrote some notes, but I can't read them anyway. But I want to say that I come from a family of 9, like that's already been said, but I had 3 older brothers. My brother Kenny was the third, and then myself. And I guess we had what you call the Irish twins. My mother had 6 children in less than 6 years. So we're all basically a year apart, very close. We grew up on a farm in Ayer, Massachusetts. Mostly with my grandmother and grandfather. My mother lived on the same property, but in a smaller cottage. So we all kind of hung around together. We were best friends. We had our own baseball team. We had a lot of freedom because although my mother worked 3 jobs, we didn't have a father around. So we basically had a lot of freedom and a lot of fun. People looked at us like, I guess you would remember the Little Rascals, as opposed to Andy of Mayberry. So we really loved that town, but by, let me see, 1980, most of us moved to Rhode Island. My grandfather was still living on the farm. My brother Kenny, his girlfriend Brenda, and their daughter Mandy lived with him. My brother would take care of my grandfather. He was ailing. And Kenny also had a full-time job at the local diner in 1980. I had just gotten married, and everybody else was in Rhode Island and doing their own thing. When my brother Kenny called hysterical saying that our neighbor was murdered. And this neighbor, of course, we knew all our neighbors. We got along very well with all of them. They knew all of us and really liked us. So when we heard she was murdered, I went to school on the school bus with her children, and my mother and I were so upset, we drove the hour and a half to my grandfather's house to find out more information. Plus, we were nervous because my grandfather lived right there, and we didn't know, there was a murderer on the loose. So we get to Air, and Kenny's girlfriend, Brenda, was there on the porch, and she was very upset because they were questioning my brother. Now, the protocol is whenever anybody has a police record, they're the first people, they would round them up, bring them to the police station and question them. It's not really a big deal. But she was very indignant about it, like that they're just harassing him. This woman was stabbed 36 times. She was beaten over the head with a lamp, a toaster. At the time, she was recovering from a heart attack. She was 48 years old. It was a very brutal murder. And they asked all these people to come to the police station because they were looking for somebody that left a lot of blood behind, so somebody was scratched, somebody was cut. And she had her jewelry supposedly stolen or money because there was a trail of blood right to a closet where she kept this pocketbook. So Kenny went to the police station along with everybody else, and they strip searched him. They did not find a single scratch on him. They checked his alibi. One alibi was that he worked the night before at the diner till like 8 o'clock in the morning. And all the police officers would go there for coffee, so they knew right where it was. It was a 2-minute walk from the police station. So they checked out his alibi. And he had another alibi. He was in court that morning for assaulting a police officer. And I have to say, it's the only time I was happy that my brother was in court. Because what better alibi than that? So Kenny offered also to take a voice stress test, which he did, passed, and so we thought that was the end of it. So fast forward now to 1982, about 2.5 years later, October 1982, she was murdered May of 1980. So October 1982, my grandfather had passed away. Brenda and Kenny had broken up, not a nice breakup, and Kenny was living in Rhode Island with my mother. Actually, this day in October, the day before, I was having a conversation with Kenny because he was planning on enrolling in a technical school, and I was helping him do that. When the next morning, I get a call, I think it was 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, from my mother. She was hysterical because the Air Police came to the door and arrested my brother Kenny for the murder of Mrs. Brow. That was her name. And we couldn't believe it. It was out of the clear blue. We didn't have a clue that they were even thinking about Kenny anymore. So I immediately went to the police station where Kenny was. I mean, he was at Billerica House of Correction, is in Massachusetts. And I talked to Kenny. He didn't know what kind of evidence they were looking at or anything. He didn't have a clue what was going on. And of course, we knew he was innocent. And we were talking about getting a lawyer. None of us really had any money at the time. And Kenny said, we're not hiring a lawyer because all the evidence will prove that I'm innocent. There's nothing here to say I'm guilty. Why should we try to pay a lawyer? I actually did go see F. Lee Bailey, though. And I found out that at that time, now we're talking many years ago, to start a case like this, they wanted $50,000 down. So there was a lot of money back then. It still is, I think. But so that was rather out of the question anyway. And Kenny did ask me to please go to Air and make sure they still had his time cards from the diner where he worked that night because it's a big part of his alibi. I went to the diner, and the people in the diner, I tried to talk to some of the employees, and they said, I'm sorry, but the police department said that we are not allowed to talk to anybody from the Waters family or anybody in that camp. I said, oh, interesting. So we went to, there's an office separated from the diner because this one person owned like everything in town, the liquor store, the diner, a few other places, and he had a local office for everything. And this girl, Michelle, and I went to the office and asked the girl if she would look up Kenny's time card for me. And she said, well, I just finished looking that time card up for the police. They're on the way over here to pick them up as we speak. And I said, well, what did the time card say? She goes, oh yeah, he worked that night and he worked the night after. And then Michelle told this girl, well, you know, they wouldn't talk to us at the diner because the police didn't want them to. I'm like, oh boy. So I said to the girl, can I look at that card? And because of what Michelle just said, she goes, oh, I better not, because the police are on their way now, and she doesn't want to get in trouble from the police. But I was not worried because we have the time cards and it proves what we wanted to prove. So after that, we met Kenny's public defender. His name was Bernard Bradley, and we met him at the bail hearing for the first time. And when we saw him, we thought we hit pay dirt because this guy was fabulous. He was in command of the courtroom, very tall, great dressed, knew what he was talking about, walking around like he owned the courthouse. And we thought we were very lucky. After that, but Kenny did not get bail, of course. And after that, we went to lunch, my mother, my sisters, and Bernard Bradley, and we talked about the case for a little while. We found out a few things by that time. There had been a grand jury, and we found out that the main evidence against my brother was Brenda. Brenda, she was very sour about their breakup to begin with, so our thoughts were that she did this because of that, but it was for other reasons, as it turned out. But she told the police, her boyfriend, first of all, called the police to sell information about the murder, saying that his girlfriend knew information about who did this murder. So the person who answered the phone was a Nancy Taylor. She was a dispatcher, secretary to the chief, and what you call a special officer, because in those days there were not any women officers, and if a woman was raped, they would have her go and talk to the victim, because usually a victim would want to talk to another woman. So she had a police uniform and would drive a police car and act sometimes as a police officer, even though she had never gone to the academy. She answered the phone because she's a dispatcher, and she was supposed to give that call to the higher officer on duty to take this case from there. But she decided she would like this case. And she and the chief, I want to say it was said by many people that they had something else going on too. So they together went to a restaurant and met Brenda and her new boyfriend. And Brenda at first said that her boyfriend was lying, that this information is not true, that she doesn't have any information about Kenny doing anything. And by the end of the dinner, she had changed her mind because she was told that unless she cooperated and said the same things her boyfriend said, that she could be prosecuted herself for accessory after the fact. Her children could be taken away from her. Her children had been taken away from her before for neglect, so it was very real. It was neglect after she left my brother. So it was very real to her. So by the end of that dinner, this is her story. She said, Kenny did not work the night before. He came home drunk that morning at about 11 o'clock in the morning, which is when they found the body and the police were coming to that home. She said Kenny came home drunk and he had a scratch on his face from under like his nose to below his chin, very long scratch. And she said to him, Kenny, do you want to go see what's happening at Mrs. Brow's house? And he said, no. And if the police come looking for me, I'm not here. These are her words that she said, which doesn't make any sense at all. But that became her story. So I'm saying, okay, we have evidence, first of all, from a police officer that was in the courthouse the day Kenny was in the courthouse. He was being called to the scene at 11 o'clock, around 11 o'clock in the morning. And he saw Kenny, he knows Kenny, in the back of the courtroom. And I'll age myself here to say that Kenny had a three-piece suit on. And he was standing, waiting, for his turn. It was a packed courthouse, so that's why he had to stand. He saw him there, and he came to court and said, yes, I saw Kenny there. as I was on my way to the scene. And we already know that he was strip searched by local police, state police, and the chief of police, and he did not have a scratch anywhere on his body, never mind a one on his face. So, and we had the time card to prove that he worked. We have all that evidence against what Brenda is saying, so that's why we said all the evidence is in our favor. How could Kenny ever be convicted of this? Well, as time went on, 5 months went by as we're trying to gather information, and they're gathering information. My brother only saw his public defender maybe twice, and I never saw him again. None of us in the family, he didn't call us for anything, didn't ask us anything. And then a month before trial, the district attorney and Nancy Taylor, they were looking for more information, of course, and more evidence against Kenny, and they found one Roseanne Perry that was played by Juliette Lewis, and I think she did a fabulous job, and that was justice for Roseanne Perry to be played by her and look like that, because she deserved it. So Roseanne, first they come down, they came to Rhode Island maybe 6 times to try to get her to say that Kenny told her he did this. And the first 5 times she said, absolutely not. The only thing he said to me was he was questioned and they would like to pin this on Kenny, but nothing else. The 6th time, they brought mini 8 by 11 photos of the crime scene, and they said they have all this evidence against Kenny, and they know Kenny did it, and you could be next, and you should cooperate because you could be an accessory after the fact. You know, Roseanne had many problems with the alcohol and drugs and a lot of things, and they also helped her out with that a lot too, and with a police record. But what she said now was that one night she was in a van with Kenny, and they drank a 6-pack of Colt 45 and had Jack Daniels, and they were very, very drunk. And Kenny said to her, "I killed that woman and stole her jewelry." So this now became a confession. And it backed up a confession that Brenda said when she broke up with Kenny. Kenny had been drinking, she said, and they broke up, and she said to him, "You killed that woman, didn't you?" And he said, "Yeah, what's it to you?" That one sentence became known as the confession. So now they needed another person to corroborate that confession, and they found Roseanne. So that was her corroboration of the confession. And that was a month before trial. So we're at trial, and we're still thinking, of course, this jury will see the evidence, and it's clearly the evidence that we have compared to what they have. They're going to see that Kenny is innocent. And some of the other evidence they conjured up was this story, because they made it look really good in court. Like the prosecutor was very, animated, and would look at my brother and say, "He's the murderer." And my brother was a big guy, and if you didn't know him, that he was really a teddy bear, that you would look at him and say, well, "He's pretty scary looking." But and pointing at him and saying he was a murderer did not help, and our attorney never objected to anything. He was a different person in court. It was like, what happened to that person in command of the courtroom? I don't know, but it wasn't him anymore. And it was almost like he wasn't even really there. But nonetheless, we said the evidence will speak for itself. And the cop did come in and say he saw Kenny in court, the scratches, all that evidence came into court. And they had Brenda, now they have Roseanne, and there was one other piece of evidence that didn't make any sense. It was a ring that somebody who worked at the diner, Kenny sold to her for like $10 or something. And she brought it to the police station, and she said it belonged to the victim. The victim was a friend of hers, and she gave that ring to her. So the police looked at the ring. It was 2 sizes bigger than the victim. It had initials inside that had nothing to do with the victim at all. And the police asked the whole family, "Do you recognize this ring?" They said, "Absolutely not." So the police gave the ring back to, her name was Addie. And Addie went back to Germany, where she was from. So at the time of trial, the DA's office actually paid for her to come back from Germany and take the stand and tell her story. that that ring belonged to the victim, even though it was already proven that it didn't. And they asked her, well, where is the ring? She doesn't know. She gave it away to somebody in Germany. So I'm like, okay, the jury will surely see that this does not make any sense. And the only other evidence was the type O blood. There was type O blood found at the scene, and back then they did not have DNA. All they could do was type it. Kenny has type O blood. The victim was type B. So 48% of the population has type O. But they spent a whole day, the trial only lasted a week, but they spent a whole day and a half on type O blood. And I think you would swear, if you didn't know any better, that that proved that he was guilty. It was almost like it was DNA. It was far from it, though. So that and the knife that was used, it was a 3-inch paring knife. And they tried to say Kenny carried that knife with him. And the husband of the victim took the stand and said that knife belonged to them. He worked for the knife company where they made the knives. So it was like, okay, so everywhere you turn, every evidence they had, we felt that we had better evidence to prove that he was not guilty. So the day of the verdict, we were, every day, the whole family was there every day. We drove, it was an hour and a half to go there every day. We drove every day and sat through the whole trial. And we were sure on this day that Kenny was coming home. We were so sure that we were planning on what we were going to make for dinner for him, a special dinner, whatever. And then we thought we should do something nice for Bernard Bradley, because he's a public defender. He didn't get paid a lot to do this job. We can't give him money. And so we thought, you know what, maybe we'll buy him a nice briefcase or something because he did such a good job. We thought he did at that time. So we get to the courthouse and the verdict comes in. And of course, the verdict was guilty of murder and robbery. He got life in prison without any possibility of parole. We were completely devastated. And the only thing we could think of at the time was, of course, an appeal. And an appeal will work. And because we didn't know anything about the law, we thought, I think we were like most people, we thought people that went to prison, only guilty people went to prison, not innocent people. And Kenny has done things in the past, and so he might have been guilty of some things, misdemeanors or whatever, but he was innocent, so we never thought he would end up in prison. So we thought, we'll have an appeal, and this appeal will consist of, I don't know where I came up with this, but 3 smart appellate attorneys that would look at this case, and the judges rather, and they would look at this case, and they would say, there's been a terrible injustice, this person is innocent, and Kenny would be coming home. We hired an appellate attorney to help us with that. We used my grandfather's money that he left for my mother to do that. And little did I know that wasn't going to work. It did not work, and now that I know more about the law, I knew it could not possibly have worked. So Kenny had another appeal before the last appeal, but because the Roseanne Perry, the day after Kenny was convicted, she recanted. She would call my mother drunk, and it was 2 in the morning, and call her and cry and say, I'm so sorry for lying. They told me they had this evidence. I thought I was just, really doing nothing. Little did I know I was a key witness. And so we hired another local attorney to help us what do we do with this? And they hired a private investigator, and we had Roseanne come to my mom's house, and they filmed her and taped her confessing to what happened. She then the lawyer wrote a 35-page affidavit that she signed saying why she lied. So we went to court with that. That was one of the appeals. When she gets to court, she changed her mind and said, no, I told the truth the first time, I lied the second time. And she blamed one of my brothers, saying that they threatened her. And I want to tell you, everybody in my family wanted to stay so far away from Roseanne that it wasn't even funny. Nobody could get close enough nobody wanted to threaten her, nobody wanted to be near her. So that appeal, he lost that appeal. And then in 1985, he had his last appeal, and he lost that appeal because it just wasn't going to work. It's so much easier to get into prison than it takes to get out. It takes a village to get out. So I usually talk to Kenny. They have to call a collective course. At least once a week he would call. After he lost his appeal, I was waiting for his call, and he didn't call. I called his lawyer and saying, what's going on with Kenny? And it took a while to find out what happened. But what happened was Kenny became suicidal when he lost the last appeal because he figured there was just no way out. And so when I talked to him, I was very upset about him doing that, but at the same time, my heart was broken. And so on the phone, we talked, and as it turned out, he said, okay, the only way I'm going to make it in here is if you, Betty Ann, go back to school, go to law school, prove my innocence, I'll get out. Now, at first, I thought he was kidding, because I said, Kenny, do you understand? I have a GED, although the movie says I didn't. I had a GED. He said, yes, I do understand that, but I also understand that if you tell me you'll do that, I know you'll do it. And that's the kind of faith my brother had in me. I didn't have that faith in me. I think the movie also says it was my idea. It was not my idea. So that became the promise. And I enrolled in the community college, putting basically one foot in front of the other, saying, you know what, at least he'll stay alive. In the meantime, we're working on other avenues because, for instance, we got police reports back in the meantime over the years that showed, at the grand jury, Nancy Taylor said there were not any usable fingerprints in this case, so we never had a fingerprint expert take the stand or have anything to do with them because we thought there weren't any. And even a juror asked her, what do you mean by usable? And she said, we have smudged fingerprints that you can't get a reading from, and the victim's fingerprints, and that was it. So that was the end of that. But then all of a sudden, we're getting reports back, and the reports are saying so-and-so was eliminated due to fingerprint evidence. And I'm like, okay, I'm not a scientist, but pretty much I think if you can eliminate 6, 7 people, you can eliminate anybody. So I'm thinking, well, they must have either eliminated my brother or didn't even test my brother because they knew he was innocent already, but I knew that that evidence had to help my brother. So we were trying to find the fingerprints for years. That's what I was doing while I was in school, and there were other avenues that we were also trying because I did not think that I was even going to make it to law school, never mind find the Holy Grail. So. But I did. I graduated. I got my degrees, and I took the LSATs, and lo and behold, I made it to law school. And thank you. It was quite a day, but I was excited at the thought that I actually did get that far. But then I was scared to death because I thought, now that I'm here and I don't find the answer, what will I do then? What will my brother do? Like, this is the end of the road. Sort of like while I was along the way, it wasn't as drastic as actually being at the end and maybe not finding the answer. But in my second year, I believe, of law school, there was a lot of talk about DNA. And I'm like, DNA? I did a paper on it because I wanted to know more about it. And I remember my professor, she was a librarian, and she was like, well, you can't do it on DNA because there is not enough material out there to do a paper on. And I said, well, I'm sorry, I have to do it on DNA. So, because I wanted to look it up, I wanted to find out all the information, and I did. And I did the paper on it, and I found out about Barry Scheck and the Innocence Project. And I said to myself, I have to get Barry Scheck's help. I need the help from the Innocence Project because now I'm finding out that, I sort of thought I was alone, that there weren't so many people in prison that were innocent. Now I'm finding out there were hundreds of people. At that time, there weren't hundreds released yet. There were at least 80 released from the Innocence Project alone, never mind other places. So I knew there were other people out there in the same boat. And I also knew that they had hundreds of people on a waiting list, and so I was put at the bottom of the waiting list. So I go on and I finish the paper. First of all, the professor said to me later, because I never told her why I was doing the paper, nobody knew why I was there. And when she did find out, she goes, "Oh, I hope I gave you a good grade." I said, "Yeah, you did, you did." So now I finished law school, I passed the bar, and I called the Innocence Project again, and still, I'm getting up there, but not far enough. I wanted their help in finding the evidence if it still existed, because I felt that if Massachusetts knew my name, that somehow that evidence would disappear, because while I was doing my paper, I saw a lot of horror stories of people losing evidence, evidence destroyed, and back then, Massachusetts and different counties had different laws. They could have destroyed the evidence after 10 years. And my brother had already been in prison, I believe, at that time for 16 years, 16 years at that time. So when I didn't call I did call, but I said I was a student, and my friends called from law school, and we said we were working on a project, and we were doing it on Kenny Waters. So would you please look to see if there's any evidence that might be helpful to us? And this clerk, Mrs. Halloran, I'll never forget her name, she kept saying no, 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 but I don't think she really looked, and she said, that was destroyed, like, years ago. And I'm like, well, where is it written that it was destroyed? And she couldn't find anything written that it was destroyed. So I kept calling, and we bothered her so much that she actually went and looked, and she found a box. So with that, I drove the hour and a half in probably 45 minutes. And I get to the clerk's office, and I meet Mrs. Halloran, and then I tell her who I am. And I tell her that I'm Kenny's sister, and I'm his lawyer, and then she looked at me, and she didn't know what to do. And she started talking to everybody else, like, that's his sister, like, we can't show his sister this evidence. And I said, I'm his lawyer first, his sister second, I'm not leaving without seeing this evidence. And because I knew what I was looking for from the trial, I knew there was a lot of blood evidence. The perpetrator wiped his hands on a curtain, and there was towels where they stole the money. There was blood. It was blood evidence everywhere from the perpetrator. So she finally did say, okay. I came behind the counter, and she stayed with me, and we looked in the box, and I didn't want to touch anything because I was afraid I would contaminate something, or I just looked, and I could see exactly what I needed. I could see the curtain, even though it was 20 years old, and the plastic bag was old, and it was in a box that you could buy for $1 at the local supply store. But I could see that they had the evidence there, including slides with blood. And it was like, okay, so I closed it right away. And I said, okay, so we'll need to preserve this evidence. And she said, well, it's too late. The court is closed. The judges have gone home. Then I'm saying, now what do I do? I'm sitting in this office with my brother's life in a box, and they're telling me I have to leave it there. And I'm thinking, a janitor could come by and just say, this is junk or something. And then I didn't know, so I said I didn't trust anybody, that somebody might accidentally dispose of it. So I said, can I just put my letterhead on it or something? I have to do something. I can't just leave it. She goes, oh, okay, go ahead, but it's silly. So I took out, I had a lot of letterhead, thank goodness, with me, and I taped it throughout the whole box, all around it, and said, do not destroy. This is for a post-conviction relief case. And the very next morning, first thing in the morning, I had a motion to preserve that evidence, and of course it was granted. So now I call the Innocence Project because I'm a lawyer and I have the evidence. So I spoke to Wee Dow, who was the intake worker at the time. By then we're friends. We talked so many times on the phone. And he said, well, Betty Ann, now I know Barry will take this case as a consultation case, because you can do the work, you're the lawyer, you have the evidence already, which is half the battle, is finding the evidence. So I'm like, that's all I want. I just want him to help me with his name, and, you know, because I'm nobody, he's somebody, and he could help. So the next day, Barry Scheck called me, and I could have fainted, because it was like this person that was just meant so much to me. I had him on the phone, he's saying, so, how are you? I'm like, great. And he told me that he read the case, and he said that he feels that this case was a travesty of justice, was his exact words, and Kenny is innocent, we will free Kenny. And those are the words I longed to hear. And I wrote, after we were done, I wrote down every single word. So, and I wrote to Kenny and went to see him and told him every single word that Barry said. So that began, Barry took over writing to the DA's office, and Martha Coakley, and if you see the movie, you'll see her in there. But Barry started a lot of letter writing, asking to have the evidence tested, and she first disagreed, saying there's too much other evidence, that even if it comes back that it's not him, it's still him. So we definitely talked her into having this evidence tested. We had it tested, and of course, it came back just as I knew, that he was innocent, and that chances were 1 in a trillion that it was him. And like I said, there was a lot of blood evidence, and it was all one person and one person only. So within a very short time after that, still she wanted to keep him there, but with a lot of help from the Innocence Project, like I said, they had to let him go. So on March 15th, 2001, Kenny became a free man, and they vacated his sentence. So, but for the next 6 months, we had an absolute fabulous time. We were on the Oprah show. We did all the major morning shows in New York. Kenny was having a blast. He was going out with all his friends. At one point, he called me up at midnight. He was out with a bunch of nurses. They were all dancing, and he's like, they want to meet my sister. And I'm like, I'm in bed, Kenny. So, but we had fun. But then, nearly 6 months into his freedom, my brother had a fatal fall. And he died of a brain injury. But what I want to say about that is that throughout the 18 years that he was in prison, I had a nightmare and I had a dream. My nightmare was that he would die in prison. You know, it was like being brought out in a pine box, and my dream was that he would be found innocent and come out to a limo with champagne flowing. Well, he did have that limo, and he was with his family and friends, so I take solace in that. But I know I only have a few minutes left, so because there will be questions, and I will answer any questions, but one thing I always end up saying, because how I feel about so many things, is it's best said by Martin Luther King Jr., is that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So I guess that's time for questions.
If you have questions, will you hold them up and they'll be collected? Someone's coming around to collect your questions, but, oh, we've got one already. Great, thank you. Oh, how did you fund your schooling?
I paid for every bit of it. It took me 10 years, actually. I borrowed money, and I paid it off after 10 years.
Are you pleased with your career choice now that your primary cause for choosing that career?
Well, actually, it's funny because that's not really my career. I own an Irish pub. I'm a part owner of an Irish pub. I was actually working there in the movie. I really was. And I'm still there, Aiden's Pub in Bristol, Rhode Island. But I do pro bono work for the Innocence Project. I do a lot of work for them. I speak, I do legislative work. I actually have a case I've been working on for 14 years. I'm waiting right now for a phone call from the Rhode Island Supreme Court to say that they affirm the Superior Court that vacated his sentence after 24 years. So, and I think we're going to win that one too, so.
It seems to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that there are a lot of women involved in working for the Innocence Project. And if I'm right, why do you think that is?
Well, you are right. Mostly everybody, except the founders, Barry and Peter Neufeld, there are a lot of women there. And why? I don't know if I'm really not sure why, but it seems that they are maybe the compassion. This is a different kind of a job. It doesn't pay as much as corporate jobs, corporate lawyers or things like that. I'm not really sure why, but I think it has a lot to do with compassion for this kind of work.
I have a question here. Is why did Brenda and her boyfriend accuse Kenny? And then along with that is another question, is why did, I believe her name was Nancy Taylor, and why do you think, I guess it was starting with her, I'm not sure, why did he get railroaded?
Okay. Why did Brenda do this? Well, I think it was her boyfriend. It was definitely her boyfriend that started everything rolling because he wanted to make money. He thought they were just reopening the case again or trying to look at it because it became cold. And he wanted to make money. And he came up with a lie and wanted Brenda to go along with it. But his lies were different than her lies. You know what I mean? And they were both telling the lies to the chief and to Nancy Taylor. And they just chose to keep Brenda's story, They told, in the end, years had gone by, and we found out that the reason why Brenda decided to tell this story, first of all, she didn't like Kenny. They broke up, and it wasn't a nice breakup. But the police told her they were going to charge her as an accessory after the fact and possibly take her children away. And like I said, her children had been taken away for neglect, and it scared her. That's what she says. She wrote an affidavit swearing to that, but that's why she lied. And Nancy Taylor, that's another interesting story because, like I said, she was not even a police officer. We did not know that until after Kenny's conviction. She went to the academy after Kenny was convicted. She wanted to be a police officer, but in the early 80s, they did not have women police officers, not many anyway. And she was that special officer, dispatcher, and secretary. But she made more money when acting as a special officer. And maybe 2 weeks before Kenny's arrest, there was a letter given to the chief saying, tell Nancy Taylor to stop acting as a police officer because she is not one. Because I think she used to wear that uniform and drive the car, and she wanted to be a police officer and prove that she could do the job as well as any other man could do it. So when this call came in, she had no right to take that case. It should have gone to a police officer, but she pretended to be Officer Nancy Taylor because she was called that many times, and she wanted to prove that she could solve this case, and she solved it at any cost, and she knew from the very beginning, and I proved this, that she absolutely had all the evidence and knew Kenny was innocent. Nothing happened to her. Nothing. The statute of limitations ran for anything that could have happened to her.
I have several questions that are all the same, with variations. Who did it? Did they find out who did it? And did the DNA help to identify the real killer?
They did not find out who did it because only the DA's office can put the blood evidence that they have, a full, complete profile. They can put that in the data bank anytime they want, but we can't do it. Only they can do it. That should be changed. that's unreal. Like, why can't defense attorneys do it? Like, why can't other offices do it? Why just the DA's office that has reasons not to want to find the real perpetrator because maybe they were right under their noses and they don't want to look bad. They never want to look bad, which is why they hold on to these cases for so long anyway. But I did try to find the perpetrator because part of this story is that the victim, people took the stand and said this. This is not just gossip, but she had many affairs on her husband, and everybody thought she was going to Germany to leave her husband. One of the people she was having an affair with was named Romeo Collard, quite the name. But Romeo's car was seen at her house early that morning, and Romeo's wife somehow died of a gunshot wound years before. Now this girlfriend dies of all these stab wounds, and we kept tabs on him for a while, and he passed away. We found out that his neighbor died by hanging herself. How many people get those kind of contacts? So I hired a private investigator to get DNA from one of his sons, and we did. We pretended he was in a lot of trouble in the little towns next to Air. He was still around there, and we said that he was going to have a lawsuit against the town. If you give your DNA, you might be included in the lawsuit because the police beat him up once. So he gave us his DNA, and we tested it. But in the meantime, my brother fell, and he passed away, so I just forgot about the whole thing. But I said to the private investigator, I said, no one in this town of Air, it's probably not even his son. And he kept going with that, and actually found out that he was adopted. I wasn't looking in those terms, but he said he's not his son, he's adopted. So he does have another biological son, and I actually went to Florida I was still trying to look for him because I still want to test that DNA because that's who I think did it. But
So the police hasn't pursued this at all?
not at all, and they know about Romeo Collard. He was like under their radar too, but he was never really questioned seriously. No, they
There's
don't.
some questions that directly relate to that. First of all, what do we need to do to reform our justice system and ensure this stops happening to innocent people?
Oh, there are so many things to do, and very easy things to do too, because now that I've seen hundreds of people that have been exonerated, you find a fabric throughout most of the cases that are very similar. Misidentification is the number one reason for wrongful convictions, and the way they do it, they have show-ups, they have lineups with the person that's looking for, that's the person that only looks like that, nobody else does, or they show pictures, a whole bunch of them, and maybe one has a white background where everybody else has a black background. It's kind of like standing out, or I know that there are cases where police officers are, you sure you don't know who this is? And pushing pictures around, or, so they should videotape this, and from beginning to end, because even at the lineups, you'll find that the victims will say, well, I'm sort of 40% sure it was this person. By the time they get to court, they're 150% sure that is the person. So if you videotaped it right from the beginning, you would know what was going on. And the interrogation should be videotaped. And so you can see how people wrongly confess, which is another reason people end up in prison. Also, for police officers and prosecutors, there should be more checks and balances. And they should be held accountable for what they do in cases where you find, in this case, I proved that she knew exactly what she was doing, and they're not held accountable. They're just not. Prosecutors have immunity, and the police officer, she didn't have complete immunity, but the statute of limitations ran. And this is not the only person she did this to. There was another person, Dennis Maher, that got out 2 years after my brother, and she also orchestrated his arrest. It was for rape, and he spent 22 years in prison. And I can imagine there are many more people that she did this to, but she's never been held accountable, yet she took years and ruined so many lives. So there are things that can be done, and it has to be done through the legislature, of course. Things have to change. There's a thing going around called best practices, which include all the things I just said, that everybody should practice. Why not get the right person? Because for every innocent person in prison, that guilty person is still out there. And 50% of the cases of the Innocence Project has, I think, 350 cases now that they have exonerated people. 50% of those cases, they found the real perpetrator, and 48% of those cases, the perpetrators went on to do more crimes while the innocent person sat in prison. Who wants that? None of us. So there are things we can do, and some people say it costs too much money to have videotaping. What does it cost to put an innocent person in prison and have a guilty person out on the street? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So there are definitely things that people can do with the legislature. And just knowing and being knowledgeable about what really goes on, like, I never knew this happened. I really didn't. What I know now is scary.
I have a couple of questions following up. Do you get a sense of what percentages are out and out blatant framing, as in the case of your brother, or what is sloppy police work?
I think it's a combination, but I think my opinion is that it's more that they know what they're doing. They just want to solve the case at any cost. And there is sloppy police work too, but if there are checks and balances, you can see it. And you know, my brother, I blame Nancy Taylor, but not fully, because there are other police officers in that town all knew she was lying. They all knew she wasn't even a police officer. They all knew Kenny had a time card that they all saw. Did I tell you that the time card never made it to court? I missed that. The time card, the person took the stand and asked where Kenny's time card was, and they didn't have it for that week only. They had it for years before, years after, but that week it was all missing. And the last person to pick it up was one police officer, Deco, that brought it to the police station, and nobody's ever seen it since. You know, so they all knew. Buddy Deco, he saw the time card. It doesn't happen in a nutshell. So it can be sloppy police work, but other people at the police department could help make it not so.
One last question. Have you seen, since the work of the Innocence Project has been more and more in the public eye, and new discoveries and things that are changing law, like the recent things in the press about dental evidence, have you seen things moving in a more positive direction?
Oh, absolutely. DNA, first of all the people that I know would still be in prison to this day if it weren't for DNA and all the strides that it is taking. But something else that is happening too is junk science is a reason that a lot of people are in prison. And the real scientists are proving what is real and what is not. Junk science stands for a lot of people in prison. You know, they just make up these things. Like a case just came to me that there was a little 6-year-old girl that was thrown in a river, you know, and they blamed this person for it and said that he had bite marks on her. It wasn't his bite marks, it was something from the water. It had nothing to do with him whatsoever. They just made up a story, you know, and people go along with it. It sounds in court, it sounds like science, but it wasn't. Although they can do bite marks now in a certain way, in certain cases.
Well, I'm sorry we don't have any more time, but thank you so much.
I thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty Ann. So for anybody out there who thinks of something that they want to do and says, oh, it can't be done, I want you to think about Betty Ann. It's really... Okay, we have 15 minutes for that potty break, and we've got a great speaker. Magdalena Boulay is going to speak to you, and she's going to start at 1:45, so we'll see you back here.